Hey everybody, I just wanted to talk about a few ideas today. The main the title of this video is called the weak anthropic principle. And so what the weak anthropic principle is basically um, is the being's recognition of his own environment as being particularly improbable or impossible to be in that environment. Like if a fish in a fishbowl acknowledged that, wow, I have just the right pH levels, I have just the right amount of food, uh, that I'm swimming, that I'm alive. It's kind of a part of when we're alive that we recognize the beauty or the rarity of life. And so, honestly, the weak anthropic principle is I think one of the biggest drivers for modern argumentation against the existence of a creator. And it's basically saying that although human life in the universe and the fine tuning of the universe, the parameters are incredibly improbable, there's still uh, there's still the fact that we, if any, if we were brought into any form of existence, we would still consider that existence improbable based on our surroundings. And so it shouldn't be surprising that we exist in an improbable circumstance based on that we exist in that environment and there's no other environment in which we exist, so we have nothing else to compare it to. It's something like along that lines, but there's a fallacy involved with it in saying that because the circumstances that bring about human life, the creation that we exist in, is incredibly complex, and therefore it's unlikely that we would come to be in existence without a designer, without a creator, without a God. uh, we should we should ignore or not investigate the reason why these things are so improbable. And so it's basically like saying, well, everything is unlikely, and here we are. Yet, um, yet we shouldn't worry too much about why it is that way, because no matter what circumstances would have given us life, we would be there eventually to observe it. And as observers, we would always both not be surprised by our own existence and also have a mysterious element of like how we look at things coming to be. So so the weak anthropic principle is pretty interesting. And uh, and so the acronym for it is WAP, WAP. And and so the people who advocate for WAP basically saw people. Anthropic is another, like a shortened version of anthropomorphism, which is just a big fancy word for human centered. And so humans, being the highest form of intelligence on the planet, uh, center all of it, tend to center all of existence around ourselves because of our consciousness and our conscious um, knowledge of our environment. And also we have like this separation from our environment too. So all that to say, I'm going to move on to the next precept uh, of today's discussion, which is talking about a series of scripture and how it plays out. And starting from Jesus's claim of who he is, and all the way to the life of Paul. And that's a lot of scripture to cover, but I'll try to do it in just a minute or two here. So Jesus, at one point, somewhere after he feeds the 5,000 and says, "I am the bread of life," hearkening back to the Israelites when they came out of Egypt and they were eating manna in the desert. After that, he goes into Jerusalem and he's teaching the Jews, and he says, uh, "Before Abraham was born, I am." And when he says that, they go to stone him. And he vanishes from the crowd, and then he leaves, and while he's away from Jerusalem, or away from Judea, one of his friends gets sick, Lazarus, and he remains back for 2 days, and his disciples wonder why he doesn't go to Lazarus while he's sick to heal him, because obviously they know he has the power to heal sickness. They've seen it do it to many people, and so he's remaining back, and then he eventually decides to go, and his disciples said, "Well, they just tried to stone you there, and you're returning to Judea." And he said something really interesting, that when basically, like, when you're living in the light, you can see, but when you're living in the darkness, you're going to stumble. And so he's making this analogy of, like, him living in the will of God is living in the light, but if he wasn't following God's commands, he would stumble. And obviously those bring up ideas of light and darkness, death, or life and death, and which he's going to go and wake up Lazarus from his sleep, from his death. And so he's acknowledging that he is the light in the world. I think this is the way I see it anyways, and gonna go and preface with his last miracle recorded in the book of John, preface the resurrection. And so he goes, and then that's where he says another I am statement, I am the resurrection and the life, to Mary and Martha. And then he goes and prays to his Father, thanking his Father that he always hears him, and then he wakes up Lazarus, and Lazarus comes out of the tomb. And after this, you have the return to Jerusalem, the Passover meal, Judas's betrayal. Judas goes and betrays Jesus into the hands of the Pharisees for 30 silver coins, and then he comes. Jesus is teaching his disciples everything from I am the way and the truth and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. I am the vine and the branches. And then prays for the disciples, prays for himself, prays for his disciples, prays for the believers in the high priestly prayer, and then goes to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. And that's when he is arrested and betrayed and taken captive to the house of Caiaphas, where the trial takes place, the trial of Caiaphas. And so this whole story keeps playing out, and it continues, right? He goes to trial in the morning, early morning hours. Maybe I imagine it being like 2 or 3 in the morning. And this kangaroo court judges Jesus and judges him as a blasphemer and sentences him to death. But of course they have to bring him to the Roman governor, the state authority. And so Jesus is brought to them, and he's judged by them, by Pontius Pilate. And Pilate reluctantly hands him over to be crucified. Then he's given to the Jews and taken up to the Golgotha, the Mount of the Skull, and crucified for the sins of the world. And in that place, that the night grows dark, and there's an earthquake, and the veil is torn in the temple, and then his body's taken, put in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. And 3 days later, the tomb is empty. He rises, appears to Mary Magdalene, appears to Peter, appears to other disciples, appears to everybody, and then ascends into heaven. And then you have the whole book of Acts take place. The ministry of Paul, the ministry of John, the ministry of all the apostles, the ministry of Peter, the spreading of the gospel to all nations, the drawing in of all nations that were scattered at the beginning with the Tower of Babel account, and the drawing in. And so I think that, going back to the WAP, or the weak anthropic principle, I think sometimes we're just seeing our life as unlikely and saying, wow, it's really unlikely that my body would have composed itself out of formless matter, and that my mind would have given itself the ability to think. And that's one of the claims of modern atheism, is that how do I put this? in the same way that we attribute meaning to our own existence, like with the anthropic principle, we also have to create narratives for us to make sense of in the world. And that's a deeply humanist attitude. Yuval Noah Harari, the author, is behind a lot of that attitude, and he, excuse me, that's not the right way to say it. He proposes that idea as well, and that all the narratives that we've created are just human inventions, and there's not really any substantive truth behind them, or I mean, they've just helped us to get along and to bind together as human beings. And what caused us to be the most dominant life form on the planet was our not just our intelligence or ability to create things, but also our ability to create narratives and form them. And so this is the idea that behind all the religions where we go to find meaning, we attribute our lives this meaning. And so in order to create meaning, we have to create a God, we have to create a religion, we have to create a substructure or framework on which to base our moral lives. And eventually we will attain a state of enlightenment where we come to the understanding that through these narratives we have harmed the world, we have driven other species out, and we have destroyed the world. And so human beings, our narratives, especially our religions, are actually functioning as a destructive weapon against the world, and we have to basically abandon these religious substructures or philosophical substructures, because they all at their root are at our desire to get at our own unlikely existence. Something like that. But the problem still resides with Jesus on the cross, where the darkness comes over the land when he's killed and murdered for the sins of humankind. Because if you take away God from the picture, once you abandon meaning, once you abandon God, you do end up abandoning the objective reality of moral action and sin, and then good and evil just become our own inventions, whether they're invented by our own subjective mind or by the collective human herd. That's where we get our morality from. It's either one of those two things, and it's no longer a real something real, something tangible, something we can actually go and go to a source for truth. Jesus says, "I am the way and the truth and the life." So where people are looking for truth, he says something similar to Pilate. He says, "Those on the side of truth, listen to me." Why? Because, well, according to the scriptures, he is the embodiment of truth. He is the source of truth. He is the creator who was there at the beginning with his Father creating the world. It says in Colossians, he's the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Through him all things were made, things in heaven and on earth. So things that take place in this meaningful heavenly substructure, and things that take place in this earthly realm, the physical realm. He is the mind behind the matter, so to speak. He is the one who created all things. And not only did he create all things just for us to exist in an environment, but a story was going to play out in that environment, a story that points to God. And at the pinnacle of that story, you have the Son of Man himself, the one who the whole story is going to end up being about in the first place, being lifted up on a cross and shown to all nations of the world. And if you don't believe me that happened, that he was lifted up for all people to see, well, in a figurative sense, you're seeing it right now because you are hearing about the cross. You might not have ever even considered the cross as being an important event or the most important event in human history. But if Jesus is who he said he was, then it was, well, his life, death, and resurrection are the most important crux of all of human history, because he was the creator. He is God in the flesh who came and visited us. And so from him come all things that are good. And so the idea of goodness, God created the world, and the word that he attributed to all of the things that he created was that it was good. Yet just because it was good does not mean that it was perfect. I mean, sometimes when we go out into nature and we look at it, we see this almost something akin to perfection about it. But there's a corruptibility about it that we can go in and corrupt nature, or there's suffering in nature. There's prey and predators that kill. There's killing. Everything has to eat something that's alive, and so there was this corruption that came into nature, and we're told in Scripture that it comes through sin. So although everything is good and was created to be good, there was this other corrupting element that came in, and as it says in Romans chapter 8, the world was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself would be liberated from its bondage to decay. And so we're told that, again, going back to the table of nations in the book of Genesis, the story is that human beings come together and collectively build this ziggurat to communicate with the gods, and God recognizes it. God goes down and actually visits this place, recognizes that it's bad, and then he miraculously confuses all the languages of the people and spreads them out throughout all the earth. And from there, all the nations are given their allotted territories. The angels, the principalities, are given their dominion over different nations. And so in these nations, there's both an earthly narrative that is being played out, and then also a divine, not divine in that it's controlled by God, but divine in that there's God appointed rulers over these nations according to God himself. I'm not just making up this idea. In Psalm 82, it says that this council, these angels, are given power over countries. And so when we see these huge power shifts and power struggles, especially when they reflect what's happened in the past before, we remember that there's both human interests, and there's a war going on in heaven as well. It's really interesting in St. Augustine's book, The City of God. There's a section where he's talking about how Rome, in his moment, was experiencing its own collapse, and it's very similar to what we would envision would be the collapse of the West, because obviously the West was built on foundations and precepts, largely on the foundations of God, and also other foundations of liberty, and borrowing from the success of other nations. Yet when we borrowed with that success of other nations, we also probably took along some of the corrosive elements of those foundations as well. So eventually, what it says in Psalm 82 is that these principalities, they know nothing, they understand nothing, they walk about in darkness. And then it says something very interesting: all the foundations of the earth are shaken. And so when we start doing evil in the nation and pulling away from God and separating from our Creator, we lose sight of who we are and we walk about in darkness, and then all the foundations of the earth get shaken, and we live in these uncertain times. Yet the people of God can always know that despite there's this huge earthly conflict and huge heavenly conflict, both kind of occurring in the same time frame, we can put our trust in God and recognize that He has determined the end from the beginning. Not that He determines all of our daily actions or makes our choice before us, but He determines our end from our beginning, and He understands. And He's also already had victory over all of these things. And so when Augustine saw that the moral foundation of Rome that provided its success, the desire of Rome for a glory, and to be able to create a nation with liberty, that they had a moral substructure that I keep saying substructure, a moral framework under which everything else was built, from their small community from which Rome started to becoming the largest empire in the world up to that point. There was a beginning frame of mind, a liberty that the people had, but then what started causing its destruction was the slavery to their own passions and the moral entropy, and that's why the demise of Rome, the destruction of Rome, is always debated about why that happened. It wasn't any one war or any. It was both external and internal, and I think we see something similar happening in the West right now, where we perceive internal conflict in kind of the heart of our foundation, and we also experience very real threats outside of our own nation, outside of our own borders, so to speak. That there's both an external and an internal threat, and individually we face those same threats too. Sin is both creeping at the door outside of our door, and sin comes from within and corrupts who we are. And so this is why Jesus came to bring all nations to himself, and he's going to establish a kingdom that is not the kingdom of men, that is not the kingdom that is subject to corruption and decay, but a kingdom that is everlasting. And he triumphed over all the kingdom of darkness and all the powers of darkness on the cross. And anyways, I'll cut it off there. I hope this video was cool. If it was, please like it, subscribe, share it with somebody, and hope you have a nice day. See you next time.